Today we're looking at a case from the early 20th century, so sit back as we go to Australia. George David Silver was born in Homebush, near the town of Mackay in the state of Queensland in Australia. His parents came to the country from Sri Lanka, which at the time was called Ceylon, in the 1870s gold rush. The family was quite religious, and from a young age George found solace in the embrace of the local church. Over time, he became a sort of fixture, a cherished presence, and was endearingly named the church's pet. As the years went by, and George grew into adulthood, he found work as a farmhand on the vast expanse of Alligator Creek, a remote outpost 20 miles from Mackay. His employer was a man named Ching, who was of Hong Kong descent, and had himself ventured to Australia during the era of the gold rush. His wife Agnes was originally from the town of Barnstable in England. When they first married, they lived in Mackay, where they operated a small store, serving the bustling community, before they moved to Rockhampton, where they stayed for 14 years. In 1905, drawn back to the familiar surroundings of Mackay, the couple started a new venture, turning their hands to sugarcane farming. By 1908, they had settled in the serene enclave of Alligator Creek, surrounded by the verdant beauty of the Australian landscape. They lived in a modest home with their 4 youngest children. The eldest 2 had already left home. The house was not at all grand. It was a quite simple corrugated iron dwelling with a dirt floor, and strangely, the kitchen was separate from the rest of the property. But despite their modest lifestyle, they lived in far better circumstances than George Silver. Although he had been raised as a respectful member of the community, he had grown up in a very poor household. Nevertheless, it did not stop him harbouring hopes of marrying Mr. and Mrs. Ching's eldest daughter, a 17-year-old young lady named Maud. He had never approached Mr. Ching about this. Instead, he confided in a neighbour, expressing his intent to procure land from her father and construct a home so he would be able to marry Maud, and they could then start a family of their own. However, the neighbour questioned his suitability for marriage, cruelly replying, "You can't marry. You got no money. You got no blankets, no decent trousers. How would a girl like to marry you like that?" Unsurprisingly, the young man's hopes were further met with rejection by Mr. and Mrs. Ching. Maud too rebuffed his advances, putting an end to his hopes of marriage, a house, and a family of his own. Faced with dashed dreams and a heavy heart, his desperation mounted. On Friday the 17th of November 1911, Mr. Charles Ching announced that he would be travelling to the Plain Creek Mill for supplies and George Silver's wages. He said that he would be gone for most of the day. When Mr. Charles Ching returned, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. He approached his house, only to find George Silver lingering outside. The door was securely locked. Mr. Ching asked his farmhand if he knew where his wife was, and George Silver replied that he thought that Mrs. Agnes Ching had gone with the children to visit a neighbour. Mr. Ching thought this strange, and the explanation of the absence of Agnes and the children somehow did not ring true. But instead of going to look for them, he retreated to the modest confines of the kitchen to take some tea, and along with his farmhand, waited for Mrs. Ching to come back, but she didn't return. As the hours stretched into the night and the shadows deepened, Charles's unease grew. It was not like Agnes to take off without telling him where she would be going. By now it was dark, so he decided that he should go and look for her. Accompanied by his farmhand, he knocked on the doors of nearby properties, thinking that maybe Agnes had not realised the time and was enjoying a conversation with a neighbour. At each house he visited, he was told that they had not seen her or the children. As time passed, he became increasingly more anxious. Eventually the 2 men returned to the house, and Mr. Charles Ching continued to wonder where his wife had gone. He instructed his farmhand to hold a lantern, while he broke a window of the house and climbed through. But when he got inside, he was greeted by something that tore to the very fabric of his soul. His 45-year-old wife Agnes, 17-year-old daughter Maud, 5-year-old son Hughie, and his daughter Winnie, who was not yet 2 years old, lay lifeless, their bodies placed next to each other in a sort of macabre embrace. There was a sheet covering them, and placed upon it was a Bible. In the grip of despair, Charles Ching found himself observing a tragedy that seemed beyond understanding. He was now burdened with sorrow and disbelief. As he looked closer, he realised that Agnes and Maud had been shot, and it looked as if the two young children had been battered and thrown against the wall. Each life lost painted a haunting portrait of senseless brutality, which would leave an indelible stain on the collective conscience of all who bore witness to such cruelty. Mr. Ching, in an overwhelming state of shock, dispatched his farmhand to the neighbouring property to seek help. Communication links were sparse, and it was soon established that the telephone lines were down, possibly cut by the perpetrator of the crime. Instead, the neighbour provided George Silver with a horse so he could ride to the police station and notify the authorities. Amidst the urgency, the whereabouts of the other two Ching children remained unknown, yet their school bags were on the table in the house. When Mr. George Silver left, he had taken a bundle with him and had not been very quick at getting to Mackay. When he did eventually arrive at the police station, he learned that the duty officer had already been alerted, thanks to someone managing to get a communication through to them. However, George still managed to inform him that he believed the crime had been committed by bushrangers. Inspector Sweetman, accompanied by other officers, immediately went to the house and inspected the scene. Blood-stained shutters bore witness to the violence that had torn through the Ching household. The following day, a post-mortem was conducted on the deceased by Dr. William Hoare, the government medical officer. He confirmed that Mrs. Ching and her daughter Maud had been shot, while the other two children had succumbed to injuries inflicted by severe beatings. Police spoke to neighbours, who told them that about 2 or 3 o'clock they had heard gunshots, but this was not uncommon, so they did not pay any particular attention to them. In a bid to track down the two missing children, the expertise of a native Australian tracker named Charlie Dighton was sought. Amidst a sprawling landscape, his keen eye found traces of footprints, which led the search party closer to uncovering the mystery behind their disappearance. Lying 1.5 miles from the farmhouse, they found the bodies of 9-year-old Eddie Ching and his 7-year-old sister Dolly. Eddie had been shot, while his sister had been beaten. There were footprints coming away from the area. The children at the Alligator Creek State School were overcome with grief and disbelief, their innocence shattered by the stark reality of what had happened to their classmates. As the sombre news rippled through the schoolyard, it cast a heavy sense of sorrow over the once lively atmosphere as everyone struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy. As the investigation intensified, Detective Sergeant Thomas Head arrived from Townsville to take charge of the case. He soon started to harbour suspicions about the farmhand, George David Silver, whose every move, according to the detective sergeant, seemed strange. He noticed that when questioning him, his responses were often contradictory. At first, Mr. Silver's accounts of his whereabouts on the day of the murder seemed straightforward enough. He claimed that when Mr. Ching left the property, he had been shooting a hawk with Mr. Ching's gun, and had added that he spent the afternoon resting beneath the shelter of a tree near the railway line. But as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies into his statements emerged, casting doubt on the credibility of his story. The tree he mentioned, supposedly a refuge for him, remained elusive, and when asked by officers to point it out to them, he was unable to do so. He also told the police that he believed that a migrant worker had been responsible for this most terrible crime. But when the migrant worker was questioned, many witnesses were able to testify as to his whereabouts for the whole day. Although the police had to work through a maze of lies and half-truths, a ray of clarity emerged through the testimony of Grace Carey, a young schoolgirl who told officers that she had seen Mr. Silver on the 17th of November. She remembered that he was dressed in khaki trousers and a blue shirt and was talking to the Ching children near their home. This was strange, as officers had documented that when Mr. Silver had arrived at the police station that day, he was wearing dark trousers. Although a seemingly small thing, it added to the suspicion surrounding him. People started to think that he knew more about what had happened to the Ching family than he was letting on. A breakthrough occurred when George Silver confessed to a detective sergeant that he had burned some clothing stained with animal blood. When questioned about his actions, he said that he had feared being wrongly implicated in the crime. He then led police to the location where he had disposed of the clothes. Additionally, among the charred remains was a revolver that Mr. Silver claimed that he had purchased in Brisbane. However, Mr. Ching recognised the firearm as belonging to his deceased wife. The footprints that had been discovered near to where 2 of the Ching children had been found were compared to George Silver's boots, and they were a perfect match. 5 days had now passed, and Detective Sergeant Thomas Head now believed there was enough evidence to further question Mr. George Silver. As the local people learned that he was again being spoken to by the police, suspicion and outrage grew. There were cries of justice for the Ching family. Fearing a potential backlash from the community, he eventually succumbed to pressure and confessed to the crime. In his confession, he implicated 2 neighbours, named Dooley Khan and Charles Butler, as also being responsible in the murders. However, following a thorough investigation, the authorities found no evidence supporting his claim of having accomplices. In March 1912, George David Silver was brought to trial to face the grave accusation of murder. The case had attracted considerable public interest, drawing attention from across Australia, while the local community held its breath, yearning for justice, to be served for the lives lost and the innocents stolen. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and concerned citizens. It was apparent that the crime still weighed heavily on the hearts of the townsfolk. Mr. George David Silver was charged with just one of the murders, as that alone carried the sentence of death. The prosecution painted a chilling picture, alleging that the defendant's motive lay in a twisted desire for revenge, stemming from the denial of his intention to marry Miss Maud Ching. During the court proceedings, various witnesses from Alligator Creek, including neighbours and local residents, provided testimony. Among them was Peter Anthony, a neighbour who recounted an incident involving the defendant. According to Mr. Anthony, he had told Mr. Silver that he had heard that Mr. Ching sometimes makes trouble by not paying the wages of those who have worked for him. He told the court that Mr. Silver replied, "If they make trouble with me, I will make trouble with them." Mr. Anthony then said that he asked Mr. Silver how exactly he would make trouble with them, to which Mr. Silver replied, "I will likely kill some of them." Despite the prevalent public perception of his guilt and the multitude of allegations and accusations levelled against him, George Silver continued to claim that he was innocent, but chose not to testify in his own defence. Instead, the courtroom became a battleground of words and wits, as the defence lawyers vehemently contested the prosecution's case. They cast doubt on the integrity of the evidence, alleging coercion and suppression by the authorities. They claimed that their client had only confessed to the crime, as he was beaten while in custody by police officers, the very people who should be upholding the law. The prosecution countered this by informing the court that the defendant was not under arrest at the time and gave his statement willingly. The presence of charred clothing as evidence was intriguing, especially given the fact that George Silver had stolen a watch from his employer, which was subsequently discovered among the remnants of the burned garments. Despite this, the defence staunchly maintained their client's innocence and continued to refute the evidence against him. When both the prosecution and the defence had given their closing arguments, Judge Lukin spent some time summing up the case before sending the jury out to deliberate. However, a noticeable shift in the defendant occurred during the summing up, as George Silver's demeanour transformed into one of anxiety and concern. The jury only deliberated for 20 minutes before returning to find Mr. George David Silver guilty. Turning to face the defendant, Judge Lukin offered Mr. Silver the opportunity to address the court. With a measured gaze, he directed his attention at the jury, and despite the weight of the moment, in a composed manner and a clear voice, he proclaimed his innocence. Each word resonated with the depth of his conviction, echoing through the courtroom with a sense of determination that left no room for uncertainty. However, despite his claims of innocence, Judge Lukin sentenced him to death. Without taking in the gravity of the moment, George Silver was unmoved, displaying no discernible signs of emotion as the sentence was pronounced. The verdict was of course appealed, but the executive decided that the law should take its course. While awaiting his execution in Boggo Road Jail, George Silver was assisted by his spiritual advisor. When the fateful day arrived on the 10th of June 1912, he spent his final hours in prayer before being escorted to the gallows. Here he thanked the prison officers for their kindness and again proclaimed his innocence, saying that at the trial he got no justice at all and that he went to God with a clear conscience. He recited the 23rd Psalm, and while doing so, the trapdoor was opened and George David Silver was hanged. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have. and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case.